Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We will be discussing elements of a blood establishment computer system and the components to develop a complete and compliant validation plan. Just as hydrogen and oxygen make up the building blocks of the water molecule, there are certain elements that together comprise a blood establishment computer system validation. You want to ensure that your validation meets regulatory expectations and will be judged compliant by inspection agencies such as CAP, FDA, and AABB. So today, we are going to discuss each one of these elements and how they contribute to the overall validation process. Today, we'll focus primarily on validation of transfusion and donor software. However, the elements that we are going to discuss can really be applied to validation of any component of your blood establishment computer system, whether it be software validation, validation of hardware and peripherals, network interface validation, validation of migrated data, or even validation of personnel and standard operating procedures. As we move through the slides today, think about the systems and subsystems that apply to your laboratory setting. Where may validation be required? Do you have blood bank instruments or analyzers? Does your blood bank software exchange clinical data with your LIS and HIS? Does your facility use blood storage devices that integrate with your transfusion software? Does your laboratory exchange electronic data with an outside agency such as Clinical Reference Laboratory or IRL? Any new hardware such as servers, label printers, or barcode scanners may require some degree of validation. So let's define what validation is before we move on. The AABB Technical Manual defines validation as this: demonstration through objective evidence that the requirements for a particular application or intended use have been met. Validation provides assurance that new or changed processes and procedures are capable of consistently meeting specified requirements before implementation. This definition of software validation is an elaboration of the FDA guidance document, which states that software validation means confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that the particular requirements for the software's intended uses can be consistently fulfilled. In other words, validation is more than just verifying that the system works or that your tables are set up correctly. It is verifying against a set of defined requirements to ensure your system performs consistently and as expected by the manufacturer and regulatory best practices. This next slide lists the elements we're going to talk about today: validation policy or plan, requirements, risk analysis, validation scripts, proof of performance, documentation of issues, and review and approval of validation. Each one of these should be documented as part of your validation process to ensure that your validation is complete and compliant. Please note that these elements are all interrelated and that they are all pieces of the puzzle that will fit together to obtain and maintain a compliant BECS validation. Of course, all validations start with a plan. The first element we're going to talk about is your validation policy or plan. Validation really begins with qualifying your software vendor and criteria used to select your software. That same effort that you put into software selection, you should put into your validation planning. From the start, a validation master plan should be carefully drafted and designed to achieve and maintain validation throughout the life cycle of the software. Margaret Thatcher once said, "Plan your work for today and every day, then work your plan." And that's exactly what your validation policy or plan should do. Plan in advance, then follow your plan. So what actions are needed to obtain and maintain a safe and compliant blood management system? The validation plan should answer the who, what, when, where, and how of the validation process. Let's look at each of these questions in a little more detail. Starting with who, identify key personnel responsible for each step of the validation plan. Who will be involved with software selection, validation planning, project management, and training? You also need to decide who will be responsible for developing the actual validation scripts and who will be implementing them. Who will review the outcome of the validation and who has the authority to make the final approval? How is the decision made whether or not you go live with this new or changed system? Consider the time commitment and budget needed for each task. Will you be performing the validation in-house or contracting third-party experts to assist with the process? What? List the pieces of the software or hardware that need validation. If you are unsure, ask yourself this. Is there a risk to patient, donor, business, regulatory compliance, or personnel if the software or device is not working as expected? If the answer is yes, validation is probably required. Always be sure the what is clearly defined. Document vendor information, version numbers, installation details, equipment, and serial numbers. All that information should be kept in one place where it's easily retrievable. You need to decide beforehand when you are going to perform validation. Certainly, a complete validation will be required for new installations and will likely need to be repeated at regular intervals, usually associated with code upgrades and prior to taking new functionality live. Additional validation may also be needed after a change. This can mean configuration changes, patch installations, bug fixes, and procedural changes. Your validation plan should detail what constitutes a change and how the change is evaluated. In any of these situations, a risk assessment will need to be performed. Change control is a critical part of your validation master plan. It will detail the steps needed to maintain a validated state throughout the software lifecycle. Where is your validation being performed? Can portions of your validation be performed remotely? Are you a multi-site? Do some test scripts need to be performed at multiple sites due to different configurations or procedures? Each facility will be responsible for their own PQ, or validation of their people and processes. You also want to determine which non-production environment you'll be using for your validation. It is also a good time to decide where and how your validation will be stored in your facility. Electronic shared drives, or clouds, are a common place to store final documentation for two reasons. One, easy access during inspections, and two, the ability to share documentation across multiple facilities. Lastly, how? This is by far the most comprehensive objective. In the following slides, we will review some of the components that need to be included in a compliant validation. So what are requirements? Also known as user requirements, or URS, user requirements specification, requirements are simply statements that specify what a user expects or wants the software system to do. They are written statements that say how a system is expected to respond in certain situations, including worst-case scenarios. Requirements should be developed prior to the start of validation. You cannot perform a validation on a blood establishment computer system without requirements. They should be written statements documented in a language that is understandable and clear. Each requirement should be testable and measurable so that they can be verified by objective evidence how the system responded. The requirements should be singular, in which they address one need, function, or expectation. And they should be traceable. Just as you are able to trace a blood unit through your system, you want to be able to trace a requirement through your validation. Where was it used? What test case or test script was it validated in? Where is the proof that it was tested? And what was the evidence that showed the requirement was validated? So for example, in a blood donor center, you would want your system to flag a unit or prevent you from distributing a unit from a donor who tests positive for HIV. Your requirement will be stated something like this. The system shall prevent a unit from a donor with a positive HIV test from being distributed. To validate that requirement, you can create a single test case where you result a donor sample with a positive HIV test and then see if you can label or ship the unit. Be sure it is a single test case set up specific for HIV and cannot be confused with other positive test results. Keep in mind, there is no standard set of requirements for you to use for your validation. That is up to you to determine based on your facility's needs and functions and use. You might begin by using your original request for proposal specifications that listed what you wanted a computer system to do. You can use regulatory documents such as the AABB record-keeping standards or FDA guidances to develop your requirements. Vendor documentation should detail the critical control points of the software. You want to make sure you include requirements and test cases to verify the system performs as specified by the vendor. The next element, risk analysis, will be a critical part of your computer system validation. Risk analysis is a method to identify potential issues or hazards that can harm a patient, donor, or business if failure or malfunction occurs. Risk analysis is interrelated with your requirements and with your entire validation plan. It would take many resources and an almost infinite timeline to validate every field and function in a modern-day computer system. To focus your validation, you need to do an assessment on your system functionality so that you can be sure you are validating the highest risk items or those areas or functions that have the most potential to cause harm to patients, donors, or business. As part of your validation plan, you will need to define a risk categorization chart. The example on this slide defines high risk as something considered to be intolerable. It could cause death, severe injury, or harm to a patient or donor. A low risk would be that which is considered negligible, would not cause injury or harm. There are many examples of risk categories out on the web. You can develop your own chart and have as many categories as you need. You want to make sure that your validation plan includes test cases that prioritize the highest risk areas and that any function that can adversely affect patients or donors is well documented. Now that we have categorized our risks or hazard levels, and we know that we need to apply that risk analysis to our system functions and user requirements, where else would you perform a risk assessment? As part of your validation, you need to perform a risk assessment on any issues or problems that you discovered during the validation. What is the risk if an issue cannot be resolved by corrective action? Let's say making a configuration change or a setting update. Are there mitigation strategies that will reduce the risk? For example, establishing an SOP or training. How does this affect approval of your validation? What is the risk of taking the software live if high-risk issues cannot be resolved? Risk analysis must also be performed each time you make a change or modification to your software. This is a critical part of your change control process. During the software lifecycle, we want to make sure that the software we are using in production maintains a validated state at all times. You will likely need to perform table changes, bug fixes, patches, and version upgrades throughout the lifecycle of your software. But how do we determine how much validation is needed each time? If you are making a simple table change, you may be able to focus your validation on just a few functions. You want to assess what functions may be affected by that change and determine the risk if that change is not implemented correctly. Software bug fixes, patches, and service packs can get a little more complicated. You will want to analyze the information provided by the software vendor and perform a risk assessment on how those installations may affect the functions in use at your facility. You should determine how even moderate and low-risk functions will be affected. Full validation across software functionality is generally recommended for code version upgrades, especially if you are making global changes to your software or taking enhancements. You will want to carefully review vendor-supplied release notes and perform risk assessment on changes that apply to your facility processes. Version upgrades may also have an impact on your requirements and requirement risk analysis. Be sure to review those before you begin. Your validation plan should address the process of determining how much validation is needed in each of these scenarios in order to maintain a validated state and ensure patient-donor safety. Again, make a plan first and follow your plan every time. Another element of the validation are the validation scripts or validation testing plans. This is where your test cases are developed to validate your requirements. There's no standard script format required. However, there are certain items that should be included in each validation test script that you perform. Purpose and scope. The purpose and scope will list the intent of the test script and the function or functions being validated. You may also list the test cases or scenarios included within the test script. Test instruction or test entry input. Be clear as to what your data is to be entered into the system to generate a response. There should be enough information to be sure both the person implementing and the person reviewing the test script understands how the test case is being performed. Expected results. What results are expected based on the data entered? Expected results should be predetermined by both your configuration and system functionality as specified by the software vendor. Actual output. How will the actual results be recorded? You need to have a description of the actual output or another method to provide evidence of the results and outcomes that were obtained. Acceptance and rejection criteria. So what happens if the expected outcome does not match the actual outcome? Does the test case automatically fail? The pass-fail criteria needs to be stated in the test plan, as well as the procedure for reporting failed test cases. The test plan must also include name of person or persons executing the script, date of execution, and their review and/or approval signature and date. Another element that should be included as part of your validation documentation is proof of performance, which is the documented evidence of the results and outcomes that were obtained during the validation. The proof of performance should always be linked to the test cases and to the requirements being validated by those test cases. By linking the documented evidence together with the test scripts and requirements, you can provide traceability within your validation process. Electronic screen captures and videos are good tools to document results. There may be other documentation, such as reports or other printed materials, that would be adequate proof of performance based on the test case you are validating. Checklists may be adequate proof of performance if you only require observable evidence, such as instrument readouts or displays. Documentation of issues. It's inevitable that during the course of validation, you will discover some issues or problems in the system. There may be test cases that are not working exactly as you want them to work in the system design. There may be times when the expected response and the actual response of the system did not agree. Perhaps you encountered a runtime error or another unexpected system error. Any issue or problem that you discovered during validation should be documented. Documentation should include description of the problem. How did the issue come about? What test case were you performing at the time? You also need to perform a risk assessment or risk analysis of the problem, as we stated earlier. You want to assess if the issue could lead to harm of a patient or donor. There should be evidence of corrected action documentation. This could be a configuration or setting change. Document whether or not a system workaround is needed. It could be something that requires an SOP change or a training issue that you need to address with your end users. If the issue is high risk to a patient or donor safety, you need to investigate ways to reduce the risk. Some issues may require a ticket submission to the software vendor. As always, the documented issue and corrective action needs to be reviewed and signed off by the designated responsible party. The last individual element that should be part of your validation is the review and approval of all the validation documents generated during the process. The appropriate personnel performing the review are those people that you have already identified in your validation plan or policy. Ideally, to obtain independence of review, the personnel reviewing the documentation should not be the same people who implemented the validation scripts. It's always better to have a second pair of eyes reviewing the completed documentation. The reviewer should make sure that you have addressed everything that you said you were going to address in your validation plan or policy, and that all documentation is correct and complete. The reviewed validation documents should be signed and dated by the authorized personnel. Lastly, there needs to be documentation of the final approval to go live with the validated software. Final approval will indicate that all high-risk issues have been mitigated or addressed, and the final approval has been granted to go live. The sources that I use today are listed on this slide. If you are just starting to plan your validation process, or you want to update your validation plan or policy, these references are a great place to start. Thank you very much for your time today. I will turn you over back to Diane.